my former life, I was a worship leader, a pastor type. And often the word worship is used to describe something very specific, but I think of it more as the entire sort of gathering of the people of God to engage in some sort of celebration or honoring of God. And that includes multiple different things that happen in these spaces or times that we gather together. So it could include the reading of scripture. It could include rituals like baptism, communion. It includes preaching and teaching. It includes musical praise and worship. In many cases, worship is reduced to that element, right? Like we're going to sing songs together and we call that worship. So I'd say my first sort of approach is to, for theological reasons, not approach it that way. We're not just talking about music, although we are. What we're really talking about is what are the sort of things we do when we gather together as people, as a community, and go through what really are rituals that sustain our life and hopefully encourage us to be growing in our faith, not just sort of static. So that being said, what's fascinating about describing it that way is that psychology offers tons of insight into that kind of a melting pot, a tossed salad of people getting together doing these things. And if you sort of reduce down to the individual, there's one way that you could think about that in terms of like how are worship practices informing my faith as an individual, et cetera, et cetera. But what I find more fascinating is the more sort of communal or global or collective psychology that's going on. And it's not separate from individuals. Like we're all people that come into this space, but then immediately in worship, it's something different because groups are there. A big question about like what a human is and what makes a human, say, distinct or unique in comparison to other primates has to do with this really interesting capacity for collective thought, essentially. Evolutionary developmental psychologists, or Evo-Devo folks, really focus on what is it that happened in our evolutionary past that generated the kind of minds that humans have. And what's fascinating is it's not so much that we are, radically different than our sort of other kin that we come from evolutionarily, but instead humans are of a scale that is so radically more in terms of their ability to process sort of social dynamics that you start going like, there is something different going on with humans collectively than, let's say, chimpanzees. There's some parallels, but there's some really unique differences. And one has to do with this ability for joint attention. So early on in human development, you get a kid, let's say a newborn or an infant, and a lot of what they do is they learn how to attend to some object with their parent or their caregiver. And there's a level in which, chimps and others can do similar things. They can identify similar objects of concern or interest. But all of a sudden, at about 9 months, all of a sudden you see by leaps and bounds human children being able to process shared thought in much different ways. And so the way this would work is, okay, so myself and my caregiver, right? We're looking at a toy or some food or something, and they're trying to draw my attention to it. I both turn and attend to it, but then also I'll look back at my caregiver to get reinforcement. Am I looking at the right thing? Am I responding to it in the right way? Maybe let's say it is a toy that the caregiver wants me to go play with. I go, they affirm me, they reinforce, yes, that behavior is right. I look back, and now what happens is they design different studies then to say, okay, well, what if, for example, we took that toy and we hid it, right? And the caregiver left. And then some a researcher comes in and picks the box up to hidden, moves it, puts it back, and then the caregiver comes back in. Well, what is the child going to do? Is the child going to assume that caregiver knows that the thing is there or doesn't know, right? What happens is you see children being able to navigate these contexts in ways that can think about the thoughts of the caregiver, knowing that they have the wrong information, right? And so it's all these really interesting studies where all of a sudden you see children, human children, not chimps or other animals, able to imagine or think about the thoughts of others at second and third and fourth degrees of difference. And that is essentially the kind of foundation for joint attention or collective kind of cognition. What does that have to do with worship? Okay. A big part of what the Evo Devo folks say is the reason that this is important for human societies is that capacity to share attentional sort of mechanisms creates this thing called a we, and we being a shared sense of identity and community. This version of we is a higher order shared sense of identity that actually has sort of top-down effects. All of a sudden, as soon as there is a third we that we're talking about, we now are responsible to that. So now we are a collective that has shared sense of purpose, of identity, of goals, of objectives. And so if you as an individual start, kind of running afoul of that we, well, what are the consequences? Generally speaking, human societies come up with really interesting consequences in the form of norms, right? And so you enforce these norms by saying if you run against the collective we, there are going to be consequences that you have to pay. And a lot of the sort of evolution of religious communities comes out of that to say now we have what are known as religious norms or practices, because what those are doing are basically enforcing the expectations of the collective we onto the individuals. Worship is this really great space where you see this in action. We have in various religious traditions, but then specifically the Christian religious tradition, a set of ideas, a set of philosophies, a set of theologies that are inscribed in these concrete practices that we go through. So take communion as an example. All of a sudden you have a otherwise sort of abstract philosophical concept. There's this being called a God, and that God was incarnated in a person in the first century Palestine, and apparently that God died and came back to life and then told all of his followers to eat his flesh and drink his blood. Describing it in that way I always find is helpful because it's sort of like you're an anthropologist or something looking at a foreign group or society, and you go, well, that is bizarre. It is. It's very bizarre, and yet that practice is something that's set up to say, okay, here are the kind of boundaries for what it means to be a part of this community, this we, and that is you come in and you, by actually physically ingesting this bread and this wine, and depending upon which flavor of Christian you are, that does or doesn't become something different. But let's say you're a low church Baptist and it's purely a symbol, right? You're practicing obedience to what Jesus called you to do, all the way up to a Roman Catholic who says, no, there's a full transubstantiation. This becomes the flesh and the blood of the incarnate God. Well, any way you span that, what you're still doing is you as an individual are habituating yourself to this story, to this narrative, in ways that align you with this sort of collective we. And I find that a really illuminating way to think about what's going on. Like, why do we do it? Why do we gather together and do these rituals that in some ways seem a little bizarre on their face, especially in sort of the contemporary world? And a big part of it is because what humans need, whether you're a religious community or not, is you need like some concrete practices really to make real the otherwise kind of abstract thoughts and ideas that, if we're being honest, most people that are in our religious communities or churches, whatever, it doesn't connect with their sort of lived experience. Whether or not you are fully endorsing of like Orthodox Trinitarian theology, at the end of the day, I'm eating some bread and drinking some wine, and that makes me a part of this week. So that's one way I think that psych science helps sort of unpack or illuminate some of the stuff that we do in worship, and in some ways says why we do it. Now, one thing that I think is important is to avoid what's called nothing buttery. And there's Malcolm Jeeves, a neuroscientist, is where I get this terminology. But one thing that folks who operate in a sort of purely psychological or scientific realm, who aren't themselves concerned necessarily with issues of religion or faith, would perhaps look at religious community worship as nothing but. And I would want to resist that, because although it illuminates this practice, I don't want to suggest that it is nothing but, hyper-evolved primates exerting norms to make sure that no one gets out of line. I don't think that's actually a good explanation of why we specifically have religious rituals. Although there is an undercurrent within psych science to say that is why. Like, you can explain fully the existence of worship from a context of the evolution of sort of joint attention. In fact, there's one sort of popular narrative that that would suggest the entire reason we have religion at all is because of gossip, and that basically we wanted to find a way to make sure, as soon as we have this sort of joint attention, this collective we go, wait a minute, what if Susie goes and tells Johnny something that Susie and I didn't agree upon? How am I going to make sure I know what the two of them talked about? Aha! I'm going to create a God that sees all of it. And as soon as you lie, this is an affront to God, and I'll know, right? Or God will know, something like that. So there are explanations like that that are out there where they want to reduce it to nothing but that. And that's one thing that I wouldn't fully endorse, but I still think psych science offers really illuminating insights into it without reducing it to that. The other reason why I find psych science helpful, it's not just illuminating like, oh, here are the values of it, but also here are some of the things to be concerned about. And one is, because these practices, this gathering together, this forming of a collective we, is so deeply rooted in some of our evolutionary past, it's very powerful. And for those who are in positions of leadership, who are orchestrating these kind of gatherings for these ends, it's really something to be sure that you're taking care not to skew into the sort of manipulation of human psychology. And it's a very hard balance to strike, no matter what position you're in, but specifically in these positions, that people are knowingly sort of ceding power to you. And there's a great deal of responsibility that comes with that. And you see this in all sorts of, scandals that come up of religious leaders failing in this regard, or all the way to kind of cultish type communities. A lot of people wonder, how could you get involved in a cult, and when does it become a cult, right? There's, branches of Christianity where all of a sudden you're like, well, you're kind of being a cult. And I think maybe one way to describe cult-like behavior is, leveraging this sort of psychology of the human and sort of mass psychology or collective psychology for ends that run at sort of cross purposes to the stated goal of the community. And usually what it is to sort of reinforce the power of the individual at the top. And that's not the ideal for Christian worship. And that's why it's important to say, okay, we do have some more abstract conceptual ideas of what is good, what is true. And then we also have these sort of bottom-up processes of going like, oh yeah, we're recruiting and leveraging human psychology to achieve some of these ends. And that end shouldn't be the reinforcement and extra power of some lone individual or group of individuals. It should be, in the good Christian sense, to honor God and put ourselves in some position to do that. The other danger, and this is both a danger and an opportunity, and it's another sort of fine line to strike, and that has to do with what a lot of psychologists talk about in terms of prejudice, bias, and sort of tribalism. So there's a number of different intersecting research projects that have found really interesting things when it comes to religion in particular as it concerns prejudice. And prejudice being sort of defined as thoughts, feelings toward tribal outsiders, right? So you have people that you identify as your inner group, and then those who are part of the other group, anyone that's not a part of your tribe. And the interesting thing is, to a certain limit, it's actually healthy and good for humans to find like their people, right? And so you go, oh, to cultivate a sense of we, you actually do have to tribalize in this sense, to go like, oh, you and I share this interest or this concern or this goal, and you want to actually maximize that. There comes a point, though, where that sort of tribalism or tribal identity generates a kind of prejudice. And a lot of the psych research would suggest if you simply prime religion, meaning if you just, I would say, incept someone with this notion of their religion or religion in general, a kind of reverse thing happens that you might anticipate, or something that it seems counterintuitive. Most of the major world religions have explicit teaching on treating the outsider well, right? That's like core to Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. I mean, like any of them are, yes, you treat outsiders well, that's important. However, on the ground, if you prime religion, almost without fail, what happens is you see an increase in outgroup prejudice and an increase in in-group affiliation or affirmation. It's fascinating. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is because it's kind of what is necessary to cultivate a thriving tribe that can exist in certain conditions. What's changed is, and this is where back to sort of the Evo Devo folks, is we're living with Stone Age minds in the modern world. And what that means is the way that we've developed psychologically is sort of out of step with where we find ourselves today as modern humans. And one of those things has to do with rampant globalization. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you didn't travel more than like a mile and a half from your home. You knew a very small number of actual human beings, and you could conceptually keep all those people in mind. And there comes a limit, and it turns out it's about 150, that after about 150 individual humans, we just can't really keep track. And so it becomes basically a generic other. And we live in a society now that, you log in online and you see the 8 billion other humans that are out there, and you're face to face with these sort of radical differences that are really difficult for us to kind of navigate and manage. And so our propensity towards prejudice of outsiders is the challenge of saying we've evolved to generate tribes that weren't necessarily having to be prejudiced towards others, but now that we're faced with, just masses of humanity, this is a challenge. Now, I find this interesting because what that means is that some of the ancient religious traditions, these wisdom traditions, were anticipating a world that we live in, and that is, it's going to be hard to both generate real sort of thick relational capacities with a small group that also is generous towards the outsider and the other. And this is where you get almost all of Jesus' teachings are specifically that. Like, I know you all have done a great job over the last 2,000 years of developing a really robust tribal identity, but I'm here to tell you that what God desires for you is to step outside of that. Love the other, love the outsider. And what now, as we think of as worship, part of what happens in worship, I think, and I would hope, is to say we acknowledge these psychological dynamics. We acknowledge the evolutionary past that has met up and is out of sync with the modern world. We look at what our religious tradition is encouraging us to do and to be. Now, how do we think of this worship space as a way to habituate us toward that world in ways that work against our sort of evolutionary instincts, if you will? What I don't know, and this is the question that I'm still asking myself, is, so does that mean that Jesus, for example, is calling us to evolve further? Or is Jesus calling us to jump off the evolutionary trajectory altogether, right? Is that, and I kind of like that idea just because I like scandalous ideas, that in some ways Jesus is calling us to something else. In another way, Jesus is calling us to actually become human, and we're not yet. So that would be another way to think of it, that you look at the sort of evolutionary development of the human to say, actually, we haven't yet arrived. We may never arrive at what it means to be human, but it would be wrong to think that we are fully human and we just mess up, right? And we're trying to get it. No, actually, we aren't yet fully human. And so part of that becoming fully human would be to embrace our evolutionary history, but then to say we need to move sort of beyond it. We need to work against it in some ways. We need to leverage it in some ways. And that's where I think worship comes into play, because the way you design it, the way you conceive it, the kinds of things you ask people to do can either reinforce all those sort of the tribalism, but it can also say we actually need to evolve beyond. We need to recognize what's going on there and move in a different direction. Because I do a lot of research in the area of like the arts and contemporary culture, and theologically speaking, I generally will try to say, how might you, for example, go to a U2 concert and imagine a scenario where God is actually up to something in a U2 concert? Let's imagine something else, a BTS concert, or what's the K-pop boy band BTS? Yeah, what's going on there? Well, a lot of things are happening, and the theologian can go and observe and describe it theoretically or conceptually, and aren't necessarily wrong, but the psychological sciences give us some empirical tools to go and go, okay, well, what's happening on the ground with the actual humans there? And I think this pertains to worship in two ways. One, it helps us understand, let's say, and let's focus specifically on like musical worship, since there's the parallel, a musical concert of BTS and the musical section of a worship service in a Christian church. Well, there are some parallels, sort of psychologically, biophysiologically, that are basically just one-to-ones. So there's all sorts of talk about sort of mirror neurons that are activated anytime you're with humans at all, but then specifically as you're kind of collected en masse, and it's basically literally underscored by music, right? So you have all these different things going on in a concert where you have actual flesh and blood humans gathering together. You have music sort of suturing, if you want to use a psychoanalytic word, all the sort of gaps and inconsistencies in life. So it sort of like smooths out all these flows. And then because of sort of biorhythmic feedback, you get this basically response. It's not a hive mind, but it's like a hive resonance, right? So you get people that are actually physically resonating with each other, with the music. It leads to what psychologists would call, in some cases, flow and or absorption. So you get all of these things that are essentially a dopamine high, and it's a collective dopamine high. And people will often describe those experiences as spiritual, as profound, as filled with awe, not necessarily awful, but awe-filled, right? And you get there's a whole host of emotions that come out of it that are often described as self-transcendent emotions. So you feel connected to other people, or just connected to the universe, this sort of thing. All those things are in play in the musical portions of Christian worship as well. What's interesting, and why I think psychology is helpful, is because on the one hand you go to the concert and you say, well, this is great. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem of where it's not what I would describe as Christian worship is the object to which everyone is oriented is unclear. Either because there isn't one, or because it's maybe an object you wouldn't want to be oriented towards, and or it just goes inarticulate, right? There are cases where this isn't true, and I find those interesting as well. But generally speaking, if you have a stadium concert, your dopamine high, your connectedness, your awe isn't usually oriented back toward the other human beings that are actually in the room. It's just you've got your dopamine high and now you're good. And that's fine because it's a concert and no one's, you've got the ticket, you came to hear Metallica or whatever, or BTS, I'm sorry. So, no one's suggesting that you are going to be oriented towards your fellow human in a BTS concert, although BTS might hope that happens, right? But in a Christian worship service, that actually is ultimately the goal. The challenge for many Christians who either organize worship or just attend worship services is they've mistaken the concert for worship. And so what they actually go to and practice in their musical rituals is essentially the same thing. It's, at the end of the day, a dopamine high that they equate as worship as formative Christian practice, but the way that it has been structured, the way they embark upon it, doesn't actually lead them back to the community of people that is known as the church. And that's actually a problem, because what it is to me is to say that we've basically replaced what is supposed to be a communally oriented and a communally directed ritual, has become reduced to sort of individual dopamine highs. Does that mean you shouldn't have dopamine highs in worship? Not at all. I mean, it's a fantastic, it's a great drug. It's probably the best drug. And that's perfectly legitimate to say we want to structure our musical worship in ways that elevate your body, your soul, that connect you as a group. Music is a great way to do that, and the psychology would underscore that point. The question is now, as a person, as a leader, as a participant, how are we organizing, orienting, and structuring those so that that's not all that it is, right? That it's not reduced back to nothing but a dopamine high, but instead leverages that dopamine high to say, okay, now what does it mean to reach out in love to a person in my church, to the outsider in our midst, to the marginalized, to the poor. And if that's not the sort of product of our worship, then I would go, why not just go to a BTS concert? It's doing all the same things and actually probably musically is better.